Now imagine you had to make up stories about a culture and a time that is alien to your own. And even worse, you had to do it without the help of Wikipedia and Google Maps. What details do you think you might get wrong? There's no skirting the fact that the Bible is something of an enigma. No other book is even in the ballpark when it comes to how deeply the Bible has shaped our world. And yet for centuries now, the credibility of the Bible has come under heavy fire, borne out in the kind of skepticism that now fuels our common objections. I mean, given our scientific age, do you really expect me to believe a book that is packed with weird supernatural stuff? Like miracle stories of people rising from the dead, or things like angels and demons? Or, given the polarization of our tribal age, do you really expect me to believe that a book which has been translated and copied countless times and put into new languages across different generations by powerful people, that this hasn't simply been altered to suit political agendas? And how can I believe that God inspired a book that could be used historically to justify slavery or holy war, or in a book that's seemingly so full of contradictions? Now, each of these questions deserve their own video, so check out the rest of our channel for responses. But if you are serious about investigating whether the Bible stands up under scrutiny, it helps to get a sense of the unique shape of this book. Because the truth is, the Bible is far more complex than your average doubter realizes. Rather than being a single book, it's in fact a library of ancient texts. Some 66 books penned over thousands of years by some 40+ authors, from scholars and kings down to shepherds and fishermen. People who wrote in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, across 3 different continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And like any other library, it offers a smorgasbord of literary genres, from legal documents, mythic parables, geographical surveys, population statistics, historical chronicles, letters, poetry, sermons, even songs. So the task of proving the Bible then, it's complex. I mean, what does it even mean to question whether or not poetry stands up under scrutiny? So I guess what people really want to know is whether or not the historical claims that make up the Bible, whether these can be trusted. And yet, even here we bump into a problem. For despite the immensely positive track record that the Bible has of being vindicated time and time again by new archaeological discoveries, the simple truth is, so much of the ancient world has been lost to us, destroyed by the sands of time, which renders it unreasonable to expect that every claim in the Bible is going to be verified by external sources. But here's the good news. You see, despite the diversity of genres and authors, the various books of the Bible, they unmistakably come together to tell a unified story. You see, they form this mosaic or a literary constellation that points us to Jesus. The Bible is all about Jesus. So if you want to launch an investigation into the credibility of the Bible, can I humbly suggest that you start with the eyewitness accounts about Jesus that you find in the New Testament? Now, I get that you're probably dubious about these having a supernatural source, being inspired by God, which is why I'm happy to start just by offering some reasons why, at base, the Gospels should be trusted as reliable historical sources for Jesus of Nazareth. So out of the dozen or so arguments why you can trust the Gospels, let me give you just 4. Number 1, embarrassing stories. You see, the common claim of doubters is that the Gospels are nothing more than religious propaganda, designed to win over new converts and to strengthen the faithful. But the problem with this idea is the Gospels make for terrible propaganda. Why? Well, because they include all kinds of embarrassing features that are counterproductive to their credibility. For starters, you have the death of Jesus. No self-respecting Jew or Greek or Roman in the first century would be easily able to swallow the idea of God being so weak as to allow himself to be crucified a shameful death. Then you have women, whose testimony was either suspect or inadmissible in a Jewish court of law, the ones serving as the very eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. Then you have the apostles, the leaders of the early church, being painted as a bunch of bumbling fools on nearly every page. They misunderstand Jesus' teaching, they disobey his commands, they even desert him and deny him. Peter, the so-called spokesperson for the apostles, actually gets called Satan by Jesus for standing between Christ and his cross. And so, honestly, if you were writing religious propaganda to bolster your position, I can't think of anything that would tank your credibility more than including a story of Jesus calling you Satan. So given that the Gospels include all of these embarrassing stories, make no effort to airbrush out the unbecoming details, it strongly suggests that the authors are doing honest historical reporting rather than creative storytelling. Number 2, culture knowledge. Now imagine you had to make up stories about a culture and a time that is alien to your own. And even worse, you had to do it without the help of Wikipedia and Google Maps. What details do you think you might get wrong? Well, you see, those who are skeptical of the Gospels, they tend to argue that these biographies were written generations after Jesus, in cities far away from Jerusalem, by people who were never even there. But the key problem with this skeptical line of reasoning is that the Gospels are full of fleshy details that you could only know if you were genuinely an eyewitness, or had painstakingly researched eyewitness accounts. You see, the Gospel writers were intimately familiar with the religious and political tensions in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus' ministry. They knew the architecture of the buildings. They knew the major players in the story and the minor place names. They knew the topography of the region and the botany at certain heights above sea level. They knew the religious customs of Second Temple Judaism, the food and clothing styles of Jesus' culture, all the way down to the minute details of expected travel time from one town to another, or the popularity of certain Jewish names for men and women unique to that location and generation. You see, if you've ever wondered why the so-called Gnostic Gospels made famous by the Da Vinci Code, things like the Gospel of Thomas or Judas or Peter or Mary or Philip, why these are excluded from the Bible, it's not just because they're written a century too late 2nd century, but because they either leave out all of this fleshy detail or they get it all wrong. The 4 Gospels in the New Testament, on the other hand, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are full of this fleshy detail and they nail it every single time, giving evidence to the fact that they represent genuine eyewitness testimony rather than fanciful or legendary stories. Number 3, costly testimony. The sad truth is, the people who originally told these stories that make up our Gospels, the apostles, they suffered for what they claimed about Jesus. They were beaten and imprisoned, they had their possessions confiscated and their livelihoods threatened, they were stoned and shipwrecked, they went hungry and homeless. We even have good historical records that a handful of them were martyred for their faith in Jesus, with no historical evidence that any of them ever recanted under the pain of torture or the threat of death. The question is, as the ones who were there to know the truth about these stories, what would motivate these men to give such costly testimony if it were, in fact, all a hoax, a lie? You see, they stood to gain nothing in this life for preaching about Jesus. And if they made up the story about him rising from the dead or the story about him being God, then according to their Orthodox Jewish beliefs, they weren't just suffering in this life, but they stood to be condemned for all eternity under the claim of blasphemy. So the fact that the Gospels don't airbrush out the embarrassing details, the fact that they have all the hallmarks of genuine eyewitness testimony, and the fact that these eyewitnesses were willing to give up their lives and livelihoods alongside risking their eternal destinies on the truth of these stories, these lines of evidence all converge to suggest that, at the very least, the Gospels really do stand up under scrutiny. But let me give you the cherry on the cake. Number 4, the moral genius of Jesus. You see, one of the strongest reasons to trust the Gospels is the life-changing power of this enigmatic figure at the center of the biographies. Time magazine voted Jesus of Nazareth the most influential person who ever lived. And his redemptive encounters in the Gospels have transformed countless lives, alongside his sublime moral teaching, beautifying the souls of our modern civilization. You see, no one is more universally admired by people of every creed and culture than Jesus of Nazareth. And to suggest that a few biographers could invent such a character in their writings in the ancient world before fading into anonymity, it just stretches incredulity. They would have had to have been literary luminaries beyond the likes of Shakespeare. For in the words of Albert Einstein, Jesus is too colossal for the pen of phrasemongers, however artful. No myth is filled with such life. So here's my challenge for you as a newcomer, perhaps a doubter. Since truth invites questioning, why not open up the Gospels with fresh eyes to see for yourself whether the towering figure of Jesus of Nazareth and his answers to life's deepest questions are worth believing.
Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.